They dragged her out of first class like she didn't belong there. Passengers sneered as flight attendants forced her to walk down the aisle in shame. The woman said nothing, accepting the humiliation with quiet dignity until someone accidentally pulled at her jacket. That's when everyone saw them. The scars. Deep, brutal marks carved across her back. The cabin fell silent. Then the cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped out. His face changed instantly when he saw her. He knew exactly what those scars meant and who she truly was. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing for more powerful narratives about the people we overlook and the heroes who walk among us. The morning light streamed through the windows of Gate 37 as passengers for Flight 237 to Washington, D.C. formed a line for priority boarding. Amaris Caldwell adjusted her weathered canvas backpack, wincing slightly as the weight shifted against her shoulder. The motion was subtle, like everything about her. At 42, she carried herself with an economy of movement that suggested precision rather than weakness. First-class passengers may now begin boarding, announced the gate agent. Amaris stepped forward, presenting her boarding pass. The agent glanced at the ticket, then at Amaris, taking in her simple jeans, white button-up shirt, and worn leather jacket before scanning the pass with a slightly raised eyebrow. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Caldwell." The first-class cabin gleamed with polished surfaces and plush leather. Flight attendant Bryson greeted passengers with practiced warmth, his smile faltering momentarily when Amaris appeared in the entryway. "3A window seat on the left," he said, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been for the passengers ahead of her. As Amaris settled in, carefully maneuvering to accommodate her stiff right leg, she felt the gaze of Ellington Reed, the impeccably dressed investment banker in 3B. He shifted away almost imperceptibly, creating additional space between them before returning to his financial newspaper. The remaining first-class passengers boarded, executives with tailored suits and expensive watches, a celebrity chef Amaris vaguely recognized, and an older woman dripping in jewelry who would later identify herself loudly as Lorelei Westfield, board member of 3 charitable foundations. "Water before takeoff?" Amaris asked when Bryson passed. "We'll begin service once we're airborne," he replied curtly, before turning to Ellington with a warm smile. "Mr. Reed, your usual Macallan 18? The whispers began shortly after. "Must be an upgrade." "Staff travel, probably. Should have at least dressed for the section." Amaris kept her eyes forward, her expression unchanged. She'd faced worse than whispers. Lorelei's voice carried deliberately from across the aisle. "Standards these days. I remember when people respected the experience enough to present themselves appropriately." Senior flight attendant Saoirse appeared at Amaris's side, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I verify your boarding pass again? There seems to be some confusion about your seating assignment." Amaris wordlessly produced her ticket. "There must be a system error," Saoirse said, loud enough for neighboring passengers to hear. "First class is fully booked for our elite members." "My ticket says 3A, Amaris replied quietly. Ellington cleared his throat. "I pay platinum membership fees for a certain experience." His implication hung in the air like smoke. Lorelei nodded vigorously from across the aisle. "Precisely. Some of us have standards to maintain." Saoirse's smile tightened. "Ma'am, perhaps you might be more comfortable in economy. We have a free middle seat available." The silence that followed felt endless. Amaris looked at the faces around her, some smirking, some studiously avoiding her gaze, and made her decision. Without protest, she gathered her backpack and stood, her movements careful and measured. "As you wish," she said, her voice betraying nothing. The walk down the aisle felt interminable. Every eye followed her as she limped slightly, her right leg dragging almost imperceptibly. Some passengers smirked, others pretended not to notice. A businessman on his phone loudly mentioned people knowing their place. As she passed row 10, Amaris stumbled slightly when the plane shifted during loading. A passenger reflexively grabbed her jacket to steady her, inadvertently pulling the collar aside. The woman's eyes widened at the glimpse of scarred tissue that disappeared beneath Amaris's shirt. "Sorry," the woman whispered, suddenly uncertain. Amaris nodded and continued her journey of humiliation toward the back of the plane. Near row 12, a child with a juice box twisted in his seat, accidentally sending orange liquid arcing through the air. Amaris swerved to avoid the splash, her military reflexes still sharp. Her sudden movement caused her jacket to catch on an armrest, pulling it away from her body. The thin white shirt beneath did little to conceal what everyone could now see, a landscape of horrific scars across her back, visible even through the fabric. Burn marks stretched across her shoulder blades, and puckered wound sites traced patterns that only combat medics would recognize. The ambient cabin noise dropped instantly. "Those are from Kadir Valley," said an older man in row 14, his own military bearing unmistakable. "Special Ops. 2018. A flight attendant froze mid-stride, drink cart forgotten. At this exact moment, the cockpit door swung open. Captain Thaddeus Reynard stepped out for his pre-flight announcement, his commanding presence filling the narrow aisle. His gaze swept the cabin before landing on Amaris's exposed back as she attempted to free her jacket. The recognition was immediate. His professional expression crumbled. "Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell?" His voice carried through the now silent cabin. "Amaris Caldwell? Ninth Special Ops?" Amaris turned slowly, her face betraying the briefest flash of recognition before returning to careful neutrality. Thaddeus approached, his posture automatically straightening to attention. "You were Vanguard 6, Kadir Valley, 2018. His voice trembled slightly. "You saved my entire unit." The passengers sat in stunned silence as the captain of their aircraft stood before this woman they had collectively humiliated, his respect palpable in every line of his body. "This woman," Thaddeus addressed the cabin, his voice carrying clearly, "commanded the rescue operation that extracted 37 soldiers from behind enemy lines after our choppers were downed. She carried 3 wounded men on her back across mined territory under heavy fire when the extraction vehicle was hit." Sorcia's clipboard clattered to the floor. Up in first class, Ellington lowered his newspaper, color draining from his face. "She refused evacuation until every soldier was accounted for," Thaddeus continued, emotion making his voice rough. "Those burns came when she ran back into the burning transport to pull out my navigator." He swallowed hard. "They told us she didn't make it." Amaris finally freed her jacket, pulling it closer around herself. "They were wrong," she said simply. The magnitude of what had transpired began to register on the faces of the passengers. The same people who had judged her unworthy of sitting among them now understood they had been in the presence of extraordinary courage all along. Thaddeus straightened his shoulders. "This aircraft doesn't move until Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell is returned to her seat in first class." The change in atmosphere was immediate and absolute. Sorcia and Bryson, faces ashen with shame, rushed to assist Amaris. "Please, this way, Colonel," Sorcia said, her earlier contempt replaced with mortification. As they approached first class again, Ellington Reed stood abruptly. "Please, take my seat instead. It's more comfortable for your leg." Amaris regarded him steadily. "My assigned seat will be fine." Lorelei Westfield, who had been so vocal in her disdain, now had tears streaming down her heavily made-up face. As Amaris passed, the older woman reached out tentatively, touching her arm. "My son," she said, removing an MIA bracelet from her wrist with trembling fingers. "My son was in Kadir Valley. He came home. Her voice broke. "You're the reason why." Amaris paused, her expression softening for the first time. She covered Lorelei's hand with her own. "He came home because he was strong." They all were. When Amaris was settled back in her original seat, Thaddeus knelt beside her, ignoring protocol and propriety. "Why didn't you tell them who you are?" he asked quietly. Amaris looked at him, years of unspoken understanding passing between them. "Because I shouldn't have to." He nodded, recognizing a deeper truth in her words. "The flight will be smooth today, Colonel," he said, rising. "I'll make sure of it." As Thaddeus returned to the cockpit, the first-class cabin remained unnaturally quiet. No one quite knew what to say after witnessing their own prejudice laid bare. The same features they had judged as common or unworthy were now transformed in their eyes, not by any physical change, but by the revelation of who Amaris Caldwell truly was. Bryson approached with a glass of water, placing it carefully on her armrest. "Colonel, if there's anything at all you need during the flight," he said, his voice unsteady with regret. "Just this," she replied, taking the water. "Thank you." Ellington cleared his throat from across the aisle where he'd relocated. "I served 2 years in administration at Fort Benning," he said, as if offering a peace treaty. Never saw combat, though. Amaris nodded politely but offered nothing more. Her validation wasn't required for their absolution. The plane began its taxi toward the runway. Through the window, Amaris watched the ground crew going about their duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always valued. The sky above was clear blue, promising smooth travel ahead. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, she closed her eyes briefly, remembering another journey, one that had left its mark on her body and soul in ways these passengers would never fully comprehend. The roar of the engines faded into memory, replaced by the sound of distant explosions and desperate voices calling for help. Then the plane lifted off, leaving the ground behind, and Amaris Caldwell opened her eyes to the present moment, to a cabin full of strangers who had judged her unworthy until they knew her story, to a world that too often measured value by appearance rather than character. She took a sip of water and turned her gaze to the clouds. Soon they would be above them all. The plane leveled at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dimmed, and service in first class began with a formality that bordered on reverence. Bryson offered warm towels with a deference he typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. Sorsha personally delivered Amaris's meal, describing each element of the dish with careful attention. Their overcorrection was almost painful to witness. "Colonel Caldwell," Sorsha began, her voice pitched low as she leaned toward Amaris's seat. "I want to personally apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional and completely unacceptable." Amaris looked up from her untouched meal. "Thank you, but that isn't necessary." "It absolutely is necessary," Sorsha insisted, her composure cracking slightly. "My brother served. If anyone had treated him that way, I'd have been furious." "Then perhaps remember that next time before you decide who belongs where based on appearances." Amaris's tone wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. The flight attendant nodded, properly chastened, and retreated to the galley. An hour into the flight, Captain Reynard emerged from the cockpit again. He paused beside Amaris's seat. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to Ellington's vacated seat. Amaris nodded, setting aside her book. "I contacted Andrews on Secure Channel," Thaddeus said quietly once seated. "There will be transportation waiting for you when we land. Unless you'd prefer to maintain your privacy." A brief smile crossed Amaris's face. "A bit late for that, wouldn't you say?" Thaddeus chuckled. "I suppose so. Though in my defense I thought I was seeing a ghost." His expression sobered. "The official report listed you as MIA, presumed dead after the secondary extraction. What happened after we were airborne?" Amaris gazed out the window for a long moment. "The remaining insurgents counterattacked as the last chopper lifted off. I took shrapnel in the leg, couldn't make the run to the aircraft." "And they left you behind?" Thaddeus's voice was tight with controlled anger. "They made the right call. 1 life against 15 injured who needed immediate medical evacuation." She turned to face him. "I was found 3 days later by local allies, spent 8 months in a military hospital in Germany. Multiple surgeries, skin grafts for the burns. But you came home. Eventually. To a country that had already moved on, a military that had filled my position, and a family that had mourned me." Her voice remained even, without self-pity. It seemed simpler to accept the medical discharge and start over. Thaddeus shook his head in disbelief. "You deserved better." "Many do." She shifted slightly, easing the pressure on her right leg. "I'm curious, though. You recognized my scars immediately. How?" "I visited every wounded soldier from that operation in the hospital, memorized every injury, every scar pattern." His voice dropped. "Needed to see what the mission cost, and your wounds were documented in the field medic's report. That distinctive pattern across your upper back was from pulling Private Winslow through that burning metal frame." Amaris nodded, the memory playing behind her eyes. "Captain Reynard," came Sersha's voice over the intercom, "you're needed in the cockpit." Thaddeus rose. "We'll be beginning our descent soon. Would you allow me to arrange proper recognition when we land? There are people who should know you're alive." Amaris looked up at him. "I appreciate the thought, but I've built a quiet life. I'd prefer to keep it that way." He respected her wishes with a nod and returned to the cockpit. As the plane began its descent toward Washington, Lorelei Westfield moved across the aisle and took the seat Thaddeus had vacated. "My son Garrett is meeting me at the airport," she said without preamble. "He was a communications specialist with your unit." lost his hearing in one ear during the attack. She twisted the MIA bracelet in her fingers. He never stopped talking about the commander who went back for everyone. Amaris studied the older woman's face, seeing beyond the expensive makeup and designer clothes to the mother who had nearly lost her child. Garrett Westfield, she said, the name triggering a memory. He rigged the emergency beacon that ultimately guided the rescue team to our position. Lorelai's eyes widened. You remember him? I remember all of them, Amaris said simply. The older woman's composure crumbled. He's been having a difficult time. The survivor's guilt, the nightmares. Knowing you survived might help him heal. Would you consider meeting him, just briefly? Before Amaris could answer, the plane hit unexpected turbulence. The aircraft dropped suddenly, then stabilized. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a chime. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Renard speaking. We're experiencing some weather-related turbulence as we approach Washington. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Lorelai clutched the armrests, her knuckles white. I hate flying, she confessed, her earlier sophistication abandoned. Focus on your breathing, Amaris advised calmly. The aircraft is designed to handle turbulence. It's uncomfortable but rarely dangerous. The plane jolted again, more violently this time. Overhead bins popped open. A carry-on bag tumbled into the aisle. Amaris reached across Lorelai and secured the older woman's seatbelt, her movement steady despite the shaking aircraft. 5 things you can see, Amaris instructed. Name them. Lorelai looked at her in confusion. It's a grounding technique. Name 5 things you can see right now. The seat back. My hands, your jacket, the window, the ceiling lights. Good. 4 things you can touch. As Amaris guided Lorelai through the anxiety management exercise, the turbulence gradually subsided. The older woman's breathing slowed to normal. Thank you, she said softly. I used the same technique with Garrett when he first came home. I'd forgotten it worked for me too. The PA system crackled. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. I'll meet your son, Amaris said, making her decision. Briefly. Relief washed over Lorelai's face. Thank you. That's more kindness than I deserve from you today. The landing was smooth despite the weather conditions. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, passengers began gathering their belongings. The atmosphere in first class remained subdued, the earlier confrontation hanging over everyone like a cloud. When the seatbelt sign finally switched off, no one made the usual rush for the overhead bins. Instead, the passengers waited, an unspoken agreement that Colonel Caldwell would exit first. Amaris stood carefully, retrieving her backpack from under the seat. Ellington stepped aside deferentially. Bryson appeared at the front of the cabin. Colonel, if you'll follow me, we've arranged priority deplaning for you. That isn't necessary, Amaris began, but Bryson's expression was so earnest that she relented. Thank you. As she moved toward the exit, Thaddeus emerged from the cockpit in full uniform, his captain's bars catching the light. Colonel Caldwell, he said formally, extending his hand. On behalf of the crew and passengers, thank you for your service and sacrifice. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Amaris accepted his handshake with dignified grace, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to dismiss their genuine contrition. Safe travels, everyone, she said simply, then followed Bryson to the door. The jetway was empty except for 2 uniformed airport personnel waiting to escort her. At the terminal entrance, a young man in a wheelchair sat nervously, his mother's features evident in his face. Lorelai Westfield's son, Garrett. Mom texted from the plane, he explained, extending his hand. Sergeant Garrett Westfield, Communications. I never thought I'd see you again, Commander. Amaris shook his hand, noting the hearing aid in his right ear. I remember your quick thinking with the emergency beacon. You saved lives that day, Sergeant. His eyes welled with tears. They told us you didn't make it out, after everything you did for us. Yet here we are, she said gently, both still finding our way home. The other passengers began streaming into the terminal, many slowing as they passed, watching the reunion with curious eyes. Would you join us for dinner? Lorelai asked, appearing behind her son. I know it's presumptuous after how I treated you, but Garrett has so many questions, and I'd like the opportunity to properly apologize. Amaris considered the invitation. Her quiet apartment would be waiting, the silence she had grown accustomed to, the solitude that had become both comfort and prison. And here was connection, unexpected and complicated. "I have an appointment at the VA this evening," she said, "but perhaps another time." She reached into her backpack and retrieved a business card. "My contact information. Have your son call me when he's ready." Garrett accepted the card with reverence. "Thank you, Commander." As Amaris turned to leave, Ellington Reed approached, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Colonel Caldwell," he began, "I run a foundation that supports veterans transitioning to civilian careers. We're always looking for mentors with your level of experience. If you'd consider sharing your insights, many could benefit." She studied him, measuring his sincerity. "Send the details to Captain Reynard. He'll know how to reach me." With that, she nodded a farewell and made her way toward the terminal exit, her slight limp barely noticeable as she navigated through the crowded airport. Behind her, whispers followed, but they were different now, tinged with respect rather than judgment. Outside, the rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds. A military transport idled at the curb despite her request for privacy. The driver stood at attention, holding a sign with her name and rank. "At ease, Corporal," she said as she approached. "I wasn't expecting a military escort." "Captain Reynard's orders, ma'am." He called it in from the air. Amaris shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. Some battles weren't worth fighting. She allowed the young corporal to take her backpack and open the vehicle door. As she settled into the back seat, she caught her reflection in the window. The same face that had drawn scorn hours earlier now looked back at her, unchanged except for the weight of renewed recognition. She had spent years building a life defined by present choices rather than past heroism, seeking neither acknowledgement nor special treatment. Today had forced her back into the light. The question now was what to do with this unwanted visibility. Perhaps, she thought as the car pulled away from the curb, it was time to stop hiding the scars, both visible and invisible. Perhaps there was value in being seen, truly seen, not just for other veterans like Garrett Westfield, but for herself. The military vehicle merged into traffic, carrying her toward an evening that would unfold differently than she had planned, the first ripple in what would become a changed life. 1 week later, Amaris sat in the waiting area of the VA hospital, a place that had become both sanctuary and reminder. The institutional beige walls and outdated magazines were familiar companions during her weekly volunteer shifts. She scrolled through her phone, scanning the dozens of messages that had arrived since her identity had been revealed on that flight. Captain Reynard had respected her wishes about privacy, but in the age of social media, discretion had its limits. A passenger had recognized her name, connected it to the Kadir Valley mission, and posted about the encounter. The story had spread like wildfire through military networks, eventually reaching mainstream media. "Colonel Caldwell?" The receptionist's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Dr. Abernathy is ready for you." Amaris nodded and made her way down the corridor to the office she knew well. Dr. Renata Abernathy, Chief of Psychiatric Services, greeted her with a warm smile. "Your first session as mentor coordinator," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "How are you feeling about it?" "Ready," Amaris replied, setting her folder on the desk. "I've reviewed the files of the veterans in today's group. Their experiences align with areas I can address effectively." Dr. Abernathy studied her face. "That's not what I asked." Amaris smiled slightly. "I'm nervous. It's different from one-on-one counseling. More exposure." "Speaking of exposure," the doctor said, sliding a newspaper across the desk. "You've become something of a celebrity. How's that sitting with you?" The headline read, "Hero of Kadir Valley Found Alive, the Colonel Who Came Back from the Dead." "It's uncomfortable," Amaris admitted. "I've spent years building a life based on who I am now, not who I was then. This feels like being pushed backward." "Or perhaps being pushed forward," Dr. Abernathy suggested. "Your story has resonated with many veterans struggling with civilian reintegration. Sometimes the most powerful healing comes from seeing someone else walk the path ahead of you." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. The hospital administrator poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation in the East Wing waiting area. New patient having an episode. Refusing to speak to anyone except Colonel Caldwell." Amaris and Dr. Abernathy exchanged glances. "Someone who knows you?" the doctor asked. Possibly from the mission, Amaris said, rising. I'll go. They followed the administrator to the east wing, where a young woman in uniform sat rigid in a corner chair, her back pressed against the wall, eyes darting suspiciously at anyone who approached. Her right sleeve was pinned where an arm should have been, and fresh scars marked her jawline and neck. Lieutenant Priya Nassar, the administrator said quietly. First tour in Somalia, helicopter crash 3 months ago, just transferred from Walter Reed. She mentioned Kadir Valley when they tried to check her in. Amaris approached slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. Lieutenant Nassar? I'm Amaris Caldwell. The young woman's eyes locked onto her face. They said you were coming. I didn't believe them. Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it much recently. Are you really her? Vanguard 6? I was, Amaris confirmed, taking a seat nearby, not too close. A long time ago. They told us your story during training. How you carried 3 wounded men through a minefield. How you went back into a burning transport. Lieutenant Nassar's breathing quickened. I tried to do what you did. When our helicopter went down, tried to get everyone out. Understanding dawned on Amaris. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a young soldier who had tried to follow her example and was now living with the consequences. May I sit closer? Amaris asked. The lieutenant nodded, her rigid posture softening slightly. Combat stories get distorted over time, Amaris said gently. They leave out the fear, the doubt, the moments when your body screams at you to run the other way. She moved her chair closer. What really happened in Somalia, Lieutenant? Priya's eyes welled with tears. We took fire on an extraction mission. RPG hit our tail rotor. Pilot tried to control it, but we went down hard. Fuel line ruptured. I was thrown clear in the impact, but the others were trapped. Her voice broke. I could hear them screaming. And you went back for them, Amaris said softly. I got 2 out before the fire reached the ammunition. The explosion took my arm, threw me 30 feet. Her remaining hand clenched into a fist. 3 still inside. I failed them. Look at me, Lieutenant, Amaris said, her voice firm but kind. You didn't fail anyone. You acted with extraordinary courage. Sometimes courage isn't enough against impossible odds. But you got everyone out, Priya insisted. The stories say you never left anyone behind. The stories are wrong, Amaris replied. I lost 2 soldiers that day. Private Lewis died in my arms while waiting for extraction. Specialist Rivera bled out on the helicopter despite everything the medic could do. She took a breath. I remember their names every day. Their faces, the promises I made that I couldn't keep. Priya stared at her, disbelief and hope warring in her expression. The hardest lesson I've had to learn, Amaris continued, is that being willing to die for someone doesn't mean you can save them. Sometimes, despite everything we give, people still die, and we have to find a way to live with that. The younger woman's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her scarred face. How? How do you live with it? One day at a time, with help. Amaris gestured to Dr. Abernathy, who had been watching from a respectful distance. And by finding purpose in what remains. What purpose could possibly remain for me? Priya asked, gesturing to her missing arm. That's what we'll work on together, Amaris said. If you'll let me. After a moment's consideration, the lieutenant nodded. Okay. Dr. Abernathy approached with a gentle smile. Lieutenant Nassar, let's get you checked in properly. Colonel Caldwell will be part of your treatment team, I promise. As Priya allowed herself to be led away to complete her intake process, Amaris remained seated, processing the encounter. The administrator returned to her side. That was impressive, Colonel. She's been non-responsive since arrival. Amaris shook her head. Not impressive. Necessary. She stood, straightening her posture. I'll need to reschedule the group session. Lieutenant Nassar should be my priority today. Already done, the administrator assured her. And Colonel? The hospital board asked me to discuss something with you. In light of your recent public recognition, we'd like to officially offer you the position of Veterans Outreach Director, full-time with a proper salary instead of volunteer status. Amaris blinked in surprise. I have no administrative qualifications. You have something more valuable, authenticity, lived experience, and as we just witnessed, the ability to reach veterans who've closed themselves off to traditional approaches. I'll consider it, she said after a moment. Please do. We need you. He handed her a folder. The details are all here. Take your time. Later that afternoon, after spending 2 hours with Lieutenant Nassar, Amaris walked slowly through the hospital corridors toward the exit. Her leg ached more than usual, a reminder of her own unhealed wounds, both physical and otherwise. As she passed the hospital's wall of honor, she paused. The partially obscured photo of her younger self receiving the Distinguished Service Cross had been moved to a more prominent position. Beside it, a new plaque had been installed. Colonel Amaris Caldwell, Vanguard 6, Kadir Valley 2018. Her continued service heals wounds beyond the battlefield. The recognition she had avoided for so long now stared back at her, impossible to ignore. Perhaps Dr. Abernathy was right. Perhaps being seen, truly seen, wasn't just about acknowledgement of past heroism, but about creating possibility for future healing. Her phone vibrated with a text message. Captain Reynard, having dinner with some Kadir Valley veterans tonight. They'd be honored if you joined us. No pressure. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. For years, she had defined recovery as building a quiet life apart from her military identity. What if that had been wrong? What if true healing came not from separation but from integration, from embracing all parts of her story? She typed a brief reply. Send the address. I'll be there. Outside the hospital, the evening air carried the scent of impending autumn. Amaris took a deep breath, feeling something shift within her. The same woman who had boarded that flight a week ago, content with anonymity, now moved with purpose toward a different future, one where her scars, visible and invisible, might serve as bridges rather than barriers. Her phone buzzed again. Garrett Westfield. Mom mentioned you might join us for dinner sometime. The offer still stands. She smiled and typed, How about next week? Bring your questions. As she walked to her car, a young serviceman passed, automatically straightening when he recognized her. She returned his salute with a nod, no longer uncomfortable with the recognition. The parking lot was nearly empty as the sun began to set. Amaris unlocked her car but paused before getting in, watching the golden light transform the ordinary hospital building into something almost beautiful. How strange that a place of such pain could also become a sanctuary of healing. She thought of Lieutenant Nassar, of the long road ahead for the young soldier. She thought of all the veterans like her, carrying wounds seen and unseen, searching for ways to reconcile who they had been with who they might become. The folder with the job offer lay on the passenger seat. Director of Veterans Outreach, a chance to transform her personal healing into something larger, more meaningful, a way to ensure that other veterans wouldn't have to walk the lonely path she had traveled. Her phone rang. Ellington Reed, the first-class passenger who had been so quick to judge her. Colonel Caldwell, he said when she answered, I wanted to follow up about the Veterans Employment Initiative we discussed. We're hosting a fundraiser next month. Would you consider being our keynote speaker? Your story could open many doors. A week ago, she would have declined immediately. Now, she considered the invitation. Send me the details, she said. I'll think about it. As she drove away from the hospital, Amaris caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. The same face looked back at her, but something had changed in the eyes. A week ago, she had been a woman hiding from her past. Today, she was someone beginning to recognize that her scars, both visible and invisible, weren't merely wounds to be concealed, but credentials earned through sacrifice, worthy of respect, not shame. The city lights began to illuminate as dusk deepened. Amaris turned toward the restaurant where Captain Reynard and the others waited, veterans of a mission that had marked them all, gathered to remember what they had survived and to honor those who hadn't. She wasn't sure what awaited her there, what memories might surface, what emotions might emerge, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face them, not alone in her apartment with only silence for company, but in the company of others who understood the cost of service and the complicated journey of coming home. The restaurant came into view, warm light spilling from its windows. Through the glass, she could see Thaddeus Reynard standing with a group of men and women, some with visible injuries, all with invisible ones. He spotted her car and raised his hand in greeting. Amaris parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the evening air. It was time to reclaim not just her seat at the table, but her place in a community that had thought her lost. Time to transform years of isolation into connection. Time to acknowledge that sometimes the greatest service comes not from what we endure alone, but from how we help others endure their own battles. With steady steps, despite her aching leg, she walked toward the waiting veterans, toward a future where her scars might finally serve a purpose greater than herself.